Chapter 14. The Life Around Us. Most people think of the jungle as a place crawling with snakes and all sorts of other noxious creatures. It is. If you're a jittery person, you have to learn to function without worrying too much about what might drop on your head or hide in your shoe or creep up your leg at any moment. If you are not by nature jittery, you must learn a healthy respect for snakes and things because they're there, and you will have to watch for them. I began to develop the habit of sorting with my eyes the sticks and leaves as I walked along the trail. Some of them might turn out to be snakes, or congos, a very large ant whose bite was said to be as painful as that of a snake, but not lethal. I felt a congo crawling on my neck once, but managed to flick it off before it had a chance to attack. The cockroaches that lived in our kitchen walls were so huge we could actually hear them walking around at night. One dropped onto my bed, and when I turned on my flashlight to identify the visitor, I was astonished at its size. Surely it was 3 inches long. Cockroaches became to me the most revolting of all vermin. They laid great long strings of eggs in our cupboards and clothes boxes. They came out of the walls by the dozens at night and foraged for food in the kitchen cupboards, crawling into our pots and pans, freshly washed dishes and silverware, swarming over tables and counters and leaving their filth behind. If you stepped on one, you might be sickened to see a long, wiry worm loop its way out. I discovered one morning that the backs of my thighs were covered with what looked like insect bites. Closer examination revealed a tiny vermin clinging to each red swelling. I went to Doreen and she took one look and screamed, "Oh, kid, do you know what you've got?" I said I didn't, and spitting out the S and the C as only British can do, she said, "Scabies!" It sounded awful. It sounded like a cross between scurvy and rabies. It wasn't that serious, Doreen assured me. It was only a mite that burrows into your skin and lays its eggs, but I didn't like the sound of that. Usually it affects people who live in filth, so I set about a great washing, bathing, scrubbing, and cleaning of the house, the outhouse, and myself. Doreen gave me something to rub on the bites after I had got the mite off with a brush, and in a day or so I was free of them. Later I was visited at different times by sand fleas, which burrow under the toenails and lay eggs, by lice, by chiggers, which are particularly fond of burrowing into the flesh around your belt line. There were both snakes and scorpions around, but I had no narrow escapes myself with either of these when I lived in San Miguel. We did occasionally have to treat others who had been bitten. There were also many delightful creatures. On my way to Soledad's house one day, I saw an insect that looked, while flying, like a brilliant vermilion helicopter, but upon landing looked like nothing but a black speck. And there was a bumblebee nearly 4 inches long that would zoom up from the pathway with a buzz like a distant bomber. It was one of my sorrows that I never found a book on jungle flora and fauna in English. I wanted very much to learn the names of these fascinating things. The streams were full of small fish called campeches. They were armored rather than scaled, and were shaped like triangular prisms with a very broad mouth. It was their habit to hide under rocks, and if you knew how to do it, you could catch them with your hands. It was comical to watch a group of Indian children whooping and shrieking, trying to grab the campeches' tails between their second and third finger as they reached around a rock, lying nearly on their faces in the water. The fish would often get away and go leaping and sailing downstream, the children leaping and yelling after them. It was in order to catch these fish, Soledad later explained to me, that the Indians blackened their hands. They would be less visible in water. There were beautiful ocelots in the forest, though I saw only their skins as the Colorados took them to sell in town. A child once took me to a tree that he said he had just seen an ocelot climb. I clambered over some fallen banana trees and through some dense brush, hoping to catch a glimpse of that spotted coat. But it disappeared, and all I got for my pains was a large pod of breadfruit that had fallen nearby. We cooked and mashed it for supper to eat in place of the usual plantains, but decided we liked plantains better. The birds were almost as elusive as the wild animals. There were parakeets, macaws, toucans, and probably 100 other varieties less easily identifiable, but rarely did they perch in trees where we could see them. They kept to themselves in the forest, seldom even flying across the open spaces. but we heard their twittering and trumpeting and screeching, and sometimes Vicente would help us to see them. On a walk in the woods, he would stop dead and listen when we had heard nothing, and then exclaim in delight, "Look, a pretty precious little bird." My father had been an amateur ornithologist, able to imitate with near perfect accuracy the calls of about 60 birds, and he had often taken us children on bird walks. I learned then the necessity of being trained to see birds. To the untrained eye, they did not seem to be there. In later years, I learned to know the Indians better. I realized how unusual it was for Vicente to have appreciated the beauty of a bird. Not many Indians seemed to be aware of the loveliness around them. They noticed things that were of some use to them, trees because the wood was useful or because they bore dyes, medicinal bark, silk, cotton, or fruit, birds because they were edible, rocks because you could sharpen a machete or grind corn with them, a mountain, a river, an orchid, or a sunset. They took quite for granted. "That mountain, Senora? Why, it's been there. The sunset? Well, the sun always goes down." I began to think, when I lived in the jungle, of the harmony of God's universe. I could see his love in creating a hummingbird with flashing color and dainty wings, the power of the divine imagination so stunningly displayed to Job in the descriptions of dawn and darkness, hoarfrost and thunderbolt, wild goats, donkeys, oxen, and ostriches, and those awesome beasts, Behemoth and Leviathan. That power seemed present to me in the great silence of the forest and in the tropical storms, in the design of the helicopter insect, in the piping of the tree toads. What kind of imagination did it require to bring such wonders into being? My mind soared, trying to comprehend it all, and I found it easy to worship the God who showed himself in these things. But were the poisonous snakes and the vampire bats, the cockroach worms and the scorpions also necessary in the world's harmony? That question took me back to the beginnings of things, to the great unanswerable. Was sin necessary? Could men have lived in a world without suffering? I did not know the answer then. I do not know it now. But I think, during that first eventful year as a jungle missionary, I had my first inkling that it is not a tidy world we live in. It is not a world we can deal with sentimentally. The God of the pretty precious little bird is the God of that fierce creature whose sneezings flash forth light, whose heart is hard as stone. But I was learning too in what I saw around me, in the life of the forest, and what I found within me of hope, disappointments, and confusions, that underneath are the everlasting arms.